Okay, good morning, everyone, both live and on screen. So I was asked to, I think the next topic we agreed to do was Zionism, is that right? Is that what we said? So Zionism. So I want to explain what I think it makes sense for us to talk about and what it doesn't make sense for us to talk about. I'm not going to cover in this discussion. I'm if people want, but to me, I don't find it that interesting. A sort of exhaustive study of which Gadol said what and when, and sort of a detailed look about Rav Kook's fraught relationship with the Mizrahi, or Rav Reinus's interactions with Chibas Tzion, or whether the Beis Halevi did or didn't join the movement, or whether Rav Soloveitchik, why he initially started in Aguda and then moved to Mizrahi, and all these discussions. I don't think this chain needs to be a sort of history of exactly the positions that each prominent figure in over the last sort of few hundred years took. In addition, for my purposes anyway, unless again people feel otherwise, I'm not particularly interested in exploring secular Zionism, even though it's a very fascinating subject, and there is a link between the different secular Zionist philosophies and the different religious Zionist philosophies. Again, secular Zionism is a very, very complicated matter with numerous iterations and versions of exactly what the goal of the secular Zionist movement was and what it was aiming to achieve. Was it primarily a nationalist movement? Was it a response to anti-Semitism? Was it a way of saving lives? Was it an ideal of setting up a Jewish state or something else? Again, these are very interesting things, but I think we'll have enough to cover on a Sunday morning without going into those. My main interest is exploring the Hashkafic and religious responses to Zionism, and an attempt to present to the best of my ability the full range of opinion and just understand the conversations that took place across different perspectives. So that to me is I think enough of a broad subject anyway to handle. As I just posted something. Okay, so to the person who posted this, we'll only get to this end. Someone asked me, could theologically or philosophically, the state of Israel be destroyed? Is that a possibility? The anonymous person who posted this to me, if I can see they are, we're quite way off that. Maybe I'll just make a note of it though, that we will get to it eventually. Well, no, I mean, it is a fascinating question, hashkafically, which is the issue really of is this destined? Is the hashkafa that this is destined to be the building block of the era of Mashiach, and therefore, by definition, couldn't be destroyed? Is there some sort of theological guarantee that this is the start, or the beginning of the ultimate return? It ties into the sort of nusach tefillah of Reishit Tsemichat Geulatenu. So there is what to talk about in that. Exactly.
We won't know whether the Sapphire was right.
I think I'm not sure I'd agree fully with that. Yeah. But there's truth in what you're saying, in the sense that certainly the Rambam warns us about over speculation about the era of Mashiach, and it is a legitimate position to take that let's leave these. Are there things we can say without getting into very deep theological water around things that we know very little about, including what exactly the era of Mashiach will be? So, yeah. Yeah, okay, so I've made a note of that question. Okay, so I guess then that will be my third introduction, that all of this is given with a great sense of modesty, given that many great people have differed around this, and as everyone points out, it's a fraught matter predicting the coming of Mashiach and so on. Okay, so what can we say about it? So I want to start off with what I think isn't really the conversation, even though often it drifts towards this. And I want to spend a bit of time sort of analysing the mitzvahs of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael and Kivush Eretz Yisrael. And part of what I want to do in this series is sort of take away what I think are a lot of distractions around the subject. In other words, you can be, in principle, these are two separate debates. You can be very strongly religious Zionist or to translate that term, believe that there are reasons within Torah and Hashkafa and halacha for a support of a philosophy of Zionism, and at the same time not believe there's a technical mitzvah of Kivush or Yishuv Eretz Yisrael at the moment. The two aren't linked. Or the alternative, you can believe there's a mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael and Kivush Eretz Yisrael, and one or the other or both, and still not believe that Zionism is a religious, an acceptable religious philosophy. So we tangle up sort of the halachic debate and Hashkafic debate. The two don't necessarily go together. Just to translate terms, Yishuv Eretz Yisrael means the mitzvah of living in Eretz Yisrael. Kivush Eretz Yisrael is the mitzvah of conquering Eretz Yisrael. An example of a movement which very strongly supports Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, but not the sort of current iteration in terms of the modern state, is the old Purushim settlement from the old Yishuv. So these are a Talmidim of the Vilna Gaon who with great sacrifice in the 1800s moved to Eretz Yisrael and follow the view of the Gaon, who feels there's a very strong mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael and this is still an applicable mitzvah, and nonetheless don't believe and wouldn't define themselves as Zionists and don't believe in the current format of the state of Israel or the concept of the state, perhaps even pre the era of Mashiach. So these are two separate discussions that each of them that each needs to be looked at. Just, I suppose, defining terms before we go any further. Zionism, as I said, means lots of different things. But on its most basic level, we'll translate it for now as the belief that Jewish people have the right to a state. And in terms of religious Zionism, that this is something religiously positive for us to endeavor to create and once created, support and maintain and continue and strengthen a Jewish state. Zionism means much more than that in lots of different ways, but if that's the most basic definition of it, the right and in a Hashkafic and religious sense, the obligation, the spiritual obligation to have a Jewish state, that this is a positive spiritual endeavor in which we should embark. I think that's a reasonable definition, working definition for now, of what our share title, our discussion title means. Now, let's start with what, as I said, I don't think really is the point of the discussion. I think it's something that deserves a reasonable analysis and therefore is worth looking at. So the Torah, if you just open Chumash, it's clear that the Torah again and again tells us that there's a mitzvah to conquer and settle Eretz Yisrael. These are psukim in Sefer Devarim, and these are promises given to Avraham Avinu in Sefer Reishit and repeated through the rest of the Torah. So in and of in itself, this seems to be a pretty simple matter, that as members of Klal Yisrael who accept upon ourselves Torah and mitzvahs, this is something that we ought to do. Nonetheless, for reasons that remain not entirely clear, and this is really where the conversation starts, the Rambam does not list amongst the Tariag mitzvahs the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. And the Ramban, who wrote hasagas or footnotes or critiques on the Rambam Maimonides list of mitzvahs, questioned this already and says, I don't understand, why does the Rambam not list the mitzvahs of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael? So this is where the debate starts. Now, there's a number of suggestions and answers we can give to the Rambam. One answer is to bite the bullet and accept that the Rambam believes there's no mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. Klal Yisrael don't need to live in Eretz Yisrael. We can live wherever we want. This is difficult because of a number of Gemaras and a number of sugyas, some of which the Rambam himself paskins. So, for example, there's a Gemara in Kesuvos that talks about a couple who fall out whether to move it to Eretz Yisrael or not, to make Aliya to Eretz Yisrael or not, and the Gemara considers the possibility that if one spouse wishes to go and the other one refuses, there can be a mutual compulsion or a legitimate breakup of the marriage. In other words, this is the sort of thing in which someone can say, I'm not neglecting my spousal commitments by saying I need to move to Eretz Yisrael, and if you're not willing to go with me, that's your problem. We need to arrange a get. Now, the Gemara is more complex than that, and there are different opinions amongst the Amoraim about this topic and questions about how one paskins. But the debate in the sugya is not about the principle of Yishuv Eretz, of Eretz Yisrael being sufficiently important that one can demands of one spouse to go. The debate is how that gets balanced with the possibility, perhaps the reality, that Bovel was more of a Mokum Torah than Eretz Yisrael in that particular era, and never how do you balance competing aims. So that's not a new idea in halacha. In all ways, when we analyze halacha or analyze mitzvahs, there's always this problem of what happens when you have competing mitzvahs and how do you juggle them. Sometimes the formal rules of asay doiche lo sasay work, right? So positive mitzvah pushes aside the negative mitzvah. There's a series of principles by which we deal when there's a clash between competing mitzvahs and competing values. So the sugya is around that clash. How do we deal with the fact that at the time Eretz Yisrael was significantly less of a Mokum Torah than Bavel, at least according to Rabbi Yehuda there, and the Gemara on which one trumps and so on. So the sugya is less interesting in terms of the halacha and the ma'aseh that emerges from it. It definitely seems a consensus in the sugya that living in Eretz Yisrael is a mitzvah. In addition, it's taken by to the best of my knowledge, everyone who looks at the Rambam as untenable to say that the Rambam was oblivious, completely ignored the fact that there's the psukim say that one ought to live in Eretz Yisrael, and the Rambam himself again in his Mishnah Torah does speak about Kivush Eretz Yisrael, the conquest of Eretz Yisrael, and seems again to view that as a mitzvah, something that one ought to do. Now, there is a subtle potential difference between Kivush Eretz Yisrael and Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, and this may be the first answer to the view of the Rambam. Kivush Eretz Yisrael, which is the conquest of Eretz Yisrael, again, these are psukim in Devarim. But this would appear to be a national mitzvah as opposed to a chovas yochid, as opposed to an individual mitzvah. Let me just try and explain what I mean by that. In halacha, there are personal obligations. It doesn't matter what any other Jew is doing. It doesn't matter whether I'm part of a community or a nation or I'm completely isolated. I have a mitzvah to blow shofar. I have a mitzvah to make birchas hamazon when I eat a meal. Then we are familiar with the idea that there are chovas tzibur, there are communal obligations. If I haven't davened as part of a tzibur, I have no obligation to hear Chazaras Hashat. Chazaras Hashat is a chovas tzibur. When you have a community, in this case a minyan, then there is a chovas tzibur. In addition, there are other strata of obligation. So, for example, when I have a community, not in the sense of a minyan, but in the sense of a yishuv, the town has obligations to set up certain things, has obligations to ensure that there's yeshivas with Talmud Torah, has obligations to ensure there's a kupas, a tzedakah, that there's a gemach or the like that will arrange to care for needy and poor people. So we have a chovas yochid, obligations on individuals. We have a chovas tzibur where there's a minyan, and then you have a chovas ha'ir or the like, a city or a town or a village of Jews have various communal responsibilities. Indeed, a responsibility to set up a Beis Knesset. You have a yeshuv of Jews. They have a chiyuv to set up a Beis Knesset. So there's layers and stratas of a halacha. And there are mitzvahs which are a chovas tzibur, not in the sense of a minyan, and not even in the sense of a town or a city, but in the sense of a nation, a national mitzvah. So, for example, the mitzvah to to set up a king. Now, it's a theme of countless shiurim and Joshuas and so on. Exactly what chiyuv is having a king a good thing? Not having a king a good thing? But there's a mitzvah, at least in potential, of setting up a system of government. A chiyuv to set up a system of Sanhedrin in Eretz Yisrael. Mechias Amalek, right? There's a mitzvah to wage war against Amalek. Binyan Beis HaMikdash, the mitzvah of building a Beis HaMikdash. There are countless mitzvahs which are national mitzvahs. In other words, if you just have a yochid, or even you have a minyan, or even you have a town, these mitzvahs don't apply. It's only when you have Klal Yisrael on a national level that have such a mitzvah. And indeed, there are orders and triggers and steps to this mitzvah. So it's only after you have Kivush Eretz Yisrael and Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, that Eretz Yisrael is conquered and divided the 14 years of and so on, then there's a chiyuv to set up, have a king. It's only once there's a chiyuv to have a king that there's the mitzvah of Mechias Amalek, of wiping out Amalek. So there's a chain of sort of national, there's a sequence to national obligations around this mitzvah. So it may be, and this is one potential answer to the Rambam, that the Rambam held that Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is not a chiyuv, is not an obligation on Yechidim. Maybe it's only a national mitzvah, but nonetheless the Rambam still listed national mitzvahs. But maybe this is a mitzvah which is only triggered by Yemos HaMashiach, or at the time, let's say, when they were going into Eretz Yisrael. Now the Rambam, in his Taryag mitzvahs, when he set out to list 613 commandments, gave a number of principles to determine what enters into the category of 613 commandments. So I mentioned this on, I think, Wednesday when I was speaking in the Parsha here. The Gemara in Makkas says there are Tariag mitzvahs, there are 613 commandments, but doesn't list for us what these Tariag mitzvahs are. And when one attempts to list them, once one finds that there are, somewhere around that number of instructions in the Torah, exactly how one lists them is not entirely clear. So, for example, to tefillin shel rosh and tefillin shel yad count as 2 mitzvahs or 1 mitzvah. When the Torah repeats the same commandment several times, does that count as 1 mitzvah or 2 mitzvahs? When we discussed the Rabbanons, we saw even the seemingly far out view of the Bahag, an era from the time, a figure from the times of the Gaonim, very prominent authority, who thinks even mitzvahs Rabbanon should be listed in the Tariag mitzvah. So the count isn't entirely clear. The Rambam established 14 principles to determine what is and isn't listed in the Tariag mitzvahs. And one of the principles he says is that a mitzvah l'shar, a mitzvah which is in abeyance and only applies to one particular era of Jewish history, shouldn't count amongst the Tariag mitzvahs. So, for example, in this week's Hedra that we just read, there's a mitzvah not to ascend to Har Sinai. Rambam doesn't list that as Tariag mitzvahs because it was a one-off instruction to the Jewish people. And some of the mitzvahs around building the Mishkan, the Rambam doesn't list in the Tariag mitzvahs because these are one-off mitzvahs at the time, or not just building, I should probably say carrying the Mishkan through the desert. These are mitzvahs that's applied for 40 years of Jewish history, but then no longer after that. Binyan Beis HaMikdash, that's different. There's a mitzvah of Binyan Beis HaMikdash because that's something that applies to all time. So one of the Mefarshim, the Megillas Esther, the Sefer is called, one of the Mefarshim on the Sefer Mitzvahs, suggests that this is the view of the Rambam, that this is not a mitzvah l'doros. This isn't an eternal mitzvah. This is a mitzvah that's applied at the time of the conquest of Yeshua and will reapply at the time of Mashiach, but not in between, and therefore this doesn't fall under the, doesn't qualify in the list of 613 mitzvahs. And if this is correct, this is significant, because it means that nowadays, when we are neither in the era of Mashiach nor the era of Kivush Eretz Yisrael under Yeshua, that it wouldn't be according to the Rambam a mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. So says this reading of the Rambam. But the problem with this is that this is very difficult. The Rambam, there's a number of reasons why, both conceptually and practically speaking, this doesn't seem to make sense. And I say this, I wouldn't dare say this, I wouldn't disagree with the Megillas Esther, other than a sequence of tens of Achronim who look at this comment of the Megillas Esther really struggle to understand his view. First of all, this doesn't appear to be a temporary mitzvah. It's true that the mitzvah, maybe, arguably, is suspended at the moment in Galus. Let's take his theory for granted, though there is no allusion to this viewpoint in the Rambam. The Rambam doesn't say this elsewhere. But even if it's a mitzvah that's suspended, it doesn't mean that this is not a mitzvah l'doros. It is a mitzvah for all time. It's just until Mashiach triggers it, until we again have a melech, let's say. That's what we call Mashiach. Let's say a melech who fits under the qualifications that the Rambam lists in his Hilchos Melachim of what this future king of the Jewish people will be like, Melech HaMashiach. Till we have that, we don't have to do this mitzvah. But once we have that, we will have to do the mitzvah. So this isn't a mitzvah analogous to don't go up onto Har Sinai. This is a mitzvah that applies in principle for all time. Just in practice, there's triggers that are needed to make this possible, such as us coalescing back into a nation and being able to have a melech. So this is a very difficult explanation. In addition, the Rambam himself in Hilchos Avodim, in Periches of Hilchos Avodim, and the Rambam in Hilchos Melachim, both times says a person should live in Eretz Yisrael rather than in Chutz La'aretz. And by the way, in Hilchos Avodim, the Rambam says explicitly this is a mitzvah for all doros. So he doesn't go, even with the suggestion of the Megillas Esther, this is something that doesn't apply in Golus. In Hilchos Melachim, the Rambam, by the way, paskins this debate about which competing value trumps living in Eretz Yisrael in a non-Jewish city or living in Chutz La'aretz with a very rich Jewish life. And the Rambam paskins that living in Eretz Yisrael trumps living in Chutz La'aretz, even in a Jewish city, versus living in a non-Jewish city in Eretz Yisrael. Now, I'm not saying this to prove that the halacha is like the Rambam. It's very clear, actually, from Minhag Yisrael throughout all the Doras. Now there are limits to what one has to give up in order to live in Eretz Yisrael. I mean, even in the even 1,000 years ago, it was technically possible to move to Eretz Yisrael, and the general practice was not to do this because it involved enormous sacrifice and it was all but impossible to live a financially viable life or a spiritually viable life. So I'm not suggesting here that the halacha l'maisa is easily applicable. The Rambam himself visited Eretz Yisrael. He had access to Eretz Yisrael. He went via Eretz Yisrael before he settled in Mitzrayim, and nonetheless felt there were factors to remain in Mitzrayim, not to live in Eretz Yisrael. So I'm not here trying to give a psak halacha l'maisa based on the Rambam, a Shulchan Aruch level psak about how we weigh up competing values. But the idea that the Rambam holds, because he doesn't list it in Sefer HaMitzvahs he doesn't hold it as a mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, ceteris paribus, all else being equal, he doesn't hold it as a mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, doesn't seem a viable model. So just to summarize, the Ramban in his critique of the Sefer HaMitzvahs believes Yishuv Eretz Yisrael should be listed amongst the 613 commandments. The Rambam, for your guess is as good as mine, and I'll share with you different theories given why he doesn't list it in the Torah mitzvahs, doesn't list Yishuv Eretz Yisrael as a mitzvah, but nonetheless it's clear from his work in Mishnah Torah that he does consider it to be something one ought to do. It's a mitzvah in that sense. It may not be listed as a mitzvah, as a separate category, but nonetheless it is something that one should do according to the Rambam. We have other examples, by the way, of this. There are many mitzvahs which the Rambam doesn't list in the Torah mitzvahs for all sorts of reasons. For example, he considers any category of mitzvahs to be listed as one mitzvah. So, lovon and chelas in your tzitzis, right? So you can perform either of these separately. Nonetheless, since when you do both, they merge into one mitzvah, the Rambam lists this as one mitzvah, not two mitzvahs, and so on and so forth. So, for whatever reason, and we'll see suggestions in a few moments, Rambam doesn't list the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, nonetheless would appear to consider it a chiyuv, all else being equal. What is all else being equal? Okay, that's complicated. How do you balance living in Eretz Yisrael with other competing needs and interests? So that's the first, I think the first sort of introduction I would say about the view of the Rambam and whether it should be listed as a mitzvah. Why does, by the way, I should also point out, just because this is often missed, even if we would accept the Megillas Esther's answer to the Rambam, we would still need to ask ourselves, is the halacha like the Megillas Esther's reading of the Rambam? And you always have to be wary when someone brings a psak halacha in which they quote someone who you haven't heard of in any other halachic context, to know sort of what is the weighting of this person as a posik. And in general, halacha, the Megillas Esther is rarely brought as a practical halacha l'maisa makor. So I say this, by the way, in both ways. It's an eternal source of frustration for any halachist. It's very easy to get access to any views about all sorts of things, and I say this both to our friends on the right and our friends on the left. You can data mine halachic sources and come up with any sort of halachic conclusion. You can always find in the range of perspectives people who say a bunch of different things. But you sort of always need to ask yourself, what are the figures who I turn to when it comes to Hilchos Shabbos say about this? What are the figures I turn to when it comes to Hilchos Kashrus say about this? If I open up a Shmua Shabbos Kilchasa and I see Rav Shlomo Zalman's mastery of Shabbos, then I want to ask myself, what would Rav Shlomo Zalman say about this? So one has to be careful when one learns sugyas, how one gets sort of a balanced opinion around this. And I'll certainly say that this reading of the Rambam doesn't reflect a balanced general consensus view of the Rambam. The general consensus view of the Rambam is that the Rambam held it was a halacha to live there, and we need to now understand why he doesn't list it in Torah mitzvahs. Sorry, Aaron.
How does custom of the Yovel, one of the Torah? Because if he does, it's an event.
Exactly right. There's tens of examples. Everyone's asking about Shemitah and Yovel. There's tens of examples in which the Rambam lists mitzvahs which are in abeyance. So the Megillas Esther's explanation is very difficult. It doesn't seem to be in accordance with the Gemara. It doesn't seem to be in accordance with what the Rambam paskins in Mishnah Torah, and it doesn't seem to fit the rules of what the Rambam doesn't list as a mitzvah. So what is the answer to this question of why the Rambam doesn't list it. We don't know exactly. There's a number of suggestions put forward. There's a Avnei Nezer. Avnei Nezer was the Sachar Rebbe, very, very important Hasidic thinker and very important halachist. He says that this is simply a misunderstanding. The reason the Rambam doesn't list Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is because it's included in the mitzvah of the conquest of Eretz Yisrael, and the Rambam does list Hachrim Tachrimim, that there's a mitzvah to conquer Eretz Yisrael and destroy the 7 Canaanite nations who live there, and therefore this is simply a subcategory of that mitzvah. This is a general rule in the Rambam, in which the Rambam lists the sort of starting point of a mitzvah and doesn't consider all its sub-details to be separate mitzvahs. The Chasam Sofer talks about this, and he says that the Rambam doesn't list it as a mitzvah because it's too foundational to be called a mitzvah. Again, this ties a little bit into the discussion we had in our Parsha on Wednesday. The Rambam does list Emunah in HaKadosh Baruch Hu as a mitzvah. One of the readings I gave in the Rambam there is that the Rambam means by that the mitzvah to believe that Hashem runs the world. But the idea that God is the creator and the first cause of the world, the Rambam doesn't list as a mitzvah according to one reading of the Rambam. Maybe it's too foundational. It's sort of nothing makes sense without it. So Chasam Sofer suggests that when you look at the Torah, it's sort of clear that this is the whole narrative of the Torah. One way of reading the whole narrative of the Torah is about a journey to Eretz Yisrael. Right? The Torah is about Avram's journey to Eretz Yisrael. It's about Yaakov's journeys backwards and forwards in and out of Eretz Yisrael. It's about the story of the family of Eretz Yisrael, and it's about the journey of Klal Yisrael back to Eretz Yisrael. So he says this isn't a mitzvah. This is just something that infuses the whole of the Torah, and that's why he doesn't list it. Another suggestion is, and we discussed this actually when we learnt Torah Sheba'al Peh. The Rambam doesn't list mitzvahs which are derived from the hermeneutical principles of Torah Sheba'al Peh, which are derived from a drasha rather than explicit in Pesukim. And it's possible when you look in the Torah, that which is explicit in the Torah is the obligation on the generation of Yehoshua to move to Eretz Yisrael, but the continuous obligation may be something which is derived from Pesukim from Joshua rather than being something explicit in the Torah, and that's not the reason why it's listed. So there's a range of suggestions, none of them of which are completely conclusive as to why the Rambam doesn't list it in Sefer Mitzvahs. But leaving something as a question sometimes is better than giving an answer which doesn't seem tenable. And the Rambam definitely in his Mishnah Torah, which is a halachic work, and certainly as it translates across to the Poskim, does consider this to be a mitzvah. Now, there's another very, very important Maramokum in this subject, which is the view of a Tosfos in Ksuvos, quoting one of this, Rabbeinu Chaim Cohen. So he discusses again the mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael there in the sugya of Ksuvos, which discusses spousal disagreements about moving to Eretz Yisrael. And Rabbeinu Chaim Cohen, one of the Baalei Tosfos, is of the opinion that nowadays we do not have to move to Eretz Yisrael because of the mitzvahs of the difficulty of keeping mitzvahs atuluyos ba'aretz, difficulty of keeping the mitzvahs which are the agricultural mitzvahs of Eretz Yisrael. Now, again, this is a very important opinion. This is an opinion of one of the Baalei Tosfos. Ironically, it doesn't seem to view the view of the Rambam, because the Rambam in his Mishnah Torah does cite the mitzvah even nowadays of living in Eretz Yisrael. And again, one would have to ask oneself, is this the general view of Tosfos? And there are several other Tosfos in Shas who don't quote Rabbi Chaim Cohen and don't seem to adopt this stance. And indeed, in the era of the Baalei Tosfos, several hundred Baalei Tosfos, including really prominent individuals like the Rosh Mishantz, Rabbeinu Shimshon from Shantz and various others, perhaps 300 Baalei Tosfos moved in waves to Eretz Yisrael. So it doesn't seem as if this is the general halacha l'maisa, like this view of Rabbeinu Chaim Cohen. In addition, it's not entirely clear what exactly he meant. What is the great difficulty of keeping mitzvahs atuluyos ba'aretz? Baruch Hashem, there's now a yeshiva in Eretz Yisrael, and people seem to manage to keep mitzvahs, and even for several hundred years, when there was the Kivush Eretz Yisrael, and there was for the first time a large influx of Jews to Eretz Yisrael, and the founding of an ongoing sustainable community in Eretz Yisrael, in Sfas, where one had the Beis Yosef and Arizal and the like. People managed to live there, and it didn't seem to be a problem. Again, many of the Gedolei Achronim speak about this, Chida and others. What exactly was Rabbeinu Chaim Cohen's difficulty with it? Interestingly, it may be technical, meaning it may be l'shitosoi, because Tosfos certainly had grave sveikas and doubts about, for example, when the year of Shemitah was. Now, Shemitah is hard enough to keep if you think you know when Shemitah is. If you think you don't know when Shemitah is, and you're going to have to end up keeping, Sveika to Yoma, 2 days Yom Tov, you have to keep 2 years or more of Shemitah, then you can definitely understand why it's impossible to move to Eretz Yisrael. So it may be that his view is linked to other Sveikas in Halacha, which nowadays we have paskins and resolved, meaning there's no way to answer a suffix ultimately, but a halachic consensus has arrived at, in which we've arrived at a halachic conclusion around that. In which case, this wouldn't apply. This is the suggestion of the Chida, the Chochmas Adam, or the Chaya Adam, who was the Mechutin of the Vilna Gaon, and obviously the author of a very important halachic work, says that the sugyos of Zeraims simply hadn't been trashed out at the time. Unfortunately, for 1,000+ years, at the time of Rabbeinu Chaim Cohen, we're talking about 1,200 years, there hadn't really been much agricultural engagement of Jews in Eretz Yisrael, and therefore the sugyos simply hadn't been trashed out. And therefore, any pioneer who went to Eretz Yisrael was going to be in grave difficulty about how to keep halacha. So in which case he was saying, how can you move to Eretz Yisrael and put yourself into halachic mess, rather stay in Chutz La'aretz and avoid the problems? But again, since then, the agricultural halachas have been very, very extensively trashed out, certainly from the era of the later Rishonim, who began going to Eretz Yisrael a little more en masse, and then the 1500s, the 1400s, late 1400s, when the large number of exiles from Spain ended up in Eretz Yisrael. Since then, we have an extensive halachic working out. We have the Mabit, and we have the Beis Yosef, all the way down to in the pre-state era of Kook and the Chazon Ish and others who dealt with these halachas, and it's become a Baruch Hashem, it's become a chilek of Torah which has been restored. Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky has written a phenomenal Mishnah Berurah style work on Hilchos Roim, so you can literally open the Sefer and it looks like a page of Mishnah Berurah, in which you have the halacha psak and you have the Biur halacha, in which he explains the things. There's incredible halachic work out there. So again, the Chacham Solomon says maybe that maybe this was an issue at the time, that no one had yet engaged seriously with this Chilek of Torah. By the way, I just as an aside, since we're talking about the history of the settlement of Eretz Yisrael, it is a mistake to think there was 2,000 years of no Jews in Eretz Yisrael. First of all, significant communities in Eretz Yisrael lasted till the years till the year 900 at least. And a new significant community was founded in Eretz Yisrael in the 1400s, late 1400s at least. The Mishnah obviously was written in Eretz Yisrael. That was till the 300s. The Talmud Yerushalmi misnamed the Talmud Yerushalmi because, of course, it wasn't in Yerushalayim; it was in the Galil by that point, because Yerushalayim was declared Judenrein by the Romans. The Romans wouldn't let Jews live in Yerushalayim, in the whole region of the centre of the country. So Jews were pushed to the periphery, but nonetheless, Jews lived in the Galil area, and there was the Talmud Yerushalmi was written. Many after the conclusion of the Talmud Yerushalmi, there was definitely a dramatic decline in learning and scholarship in Eretz Yisrael, but there were still prominent Jews living there. Many of the midrashim that we have today date from Eretz Yisrael. Many of the piyutim that we have, including those of Rabbi Elazar HaKaleh, according to some viewpoints, come from Eretz Yisrael in that era. And the Masorah, the most authentic and accurate versions of the Sifrei Torah and the Trop and the notes of the Sifrei Torah come from Bali Masorah, who lived in Tiberias. And when we talk about figures like Ben Osher, and the Rambam accredited Ben Osher's text of the Sefer Torah and the vowels and the footnotes and so on that he puts in there as the most accurate one. These came from, we can call them yeshivas or academies that existed in Tiberia at the time, in which people were very, very seriously osek in Talmud Torah of a particular area of halacha, the area of the Masorah of the text of the Torah. So there's serious Torah going on in Eretz Yisrael. There were yeshivas there with Rosh yeshivas who considered themselves, we would say in hindsight mistakenly, but they consider themselves the equals of the Gaonim in Bovel, and they resented the dominance of the Gaonim. Gaonim is another way of saying the Rosh Yeshivas in Bovel over the Rosh Yeshivas in Eretz Yisrael. I think in hindsight, we would say that the scholarship of the great figures who led the yeshivas in Eretz Yisrael, by the time we get to the 800s, 700s, 800s, 900s, did not match their peers in Bovel. Bovel had superseded learning Eretz Yisrael. But these were significant Talmidei Chacham and significant places of Torah learning. There was a debate, which I'm not going to go into now, about the calendar and the calendar calculations, and basically a divide between the Gaonim, in other words, the Rosh Yeshiva in Bovel and the Rosh Yeshivas in Eretz Yisrael, and it took the intervention of no less a figure than Rav Yogan to win decisively the battle on the side of Gaonei Bovel. In other words, till a figure like Rav Yogan, who was a heavyweight beyond any other Talmud Chacham and leader of his generation, and was considered the absolute master of Torah of his generation, till he sort of intervened and really undid the view of the sages of Eretz Yisrael, it was sort of a little bit in flux in the Jewish world who would trump in this battle. So there was significant Jewish Torah learning and present till the year 900. From then till the 1300s, there was a very, very weak period. There were Jews who lived in Eretz Yisrael, but a very weak community, to such a degree that when the Baalei Tosfos arrived in small numbers, but nonetheless relatively en masse in the 1300s, and when the Sephardim, the refugees from Spain, arrived in the 1400s and 1500s, they didn't consider this community to be a learned one with which they should seriously engage. And as a result, the halachic Masorah of this community pretty much died out. So there was tensions between the two communities, and it was considered a community of Amaratzim. It was considered an unlearned community because unfortunately their Masorah was no longer possible. So when we speak about, we nowadays like to categorize the different Masorahs as Ashkenazi and Sephardi. We're all aware there's numerous versions of traditions in the Ashkenazi world and in the Sephardi world, and in truth, Sephardi simply means the minhag of the Yotzei Sfarad, but there was also minhagim of those who never went via Spain and who always lived in the Middle East, like the minhag of Bovel and Iraq and the minhag of Iran, and so on and so forth. And these are now sometimes referred to as Eidat HaMizrach, but these are very heavily influenced by the minhag of the Sephardim, the refugees from Spain. There was another minhag which existed in Eretz Yisrael, and that's another one of these minhagim that the chain of tradition, as it were, died out. A bit like the minhag of Provence that we've discussed before, because there's no continuity to it. So there were from Jews living there, but in relatively small numbers. From the late 1400s and on, there's been a continual presence of significant numbers of Jews in Eretz Yisrael. For a time, Sefas became the Mokum Torah of the world. It became one of the most important centers of Torah learning in the world, in the era in which you had the Beis Yosef and the Mari Beirav and Arizal and the Alshich and a whole range of Shem Alkabetz and a whole range of Gedolei Olam who were living there. So Eretz Yisrael always remained a settled place. Nonetheless, the Chachmas Adam point is well taken. That it doesn't need my agreement, but he makes the point that the laws of Zoroim, Torah Zoroim, the agricultural laws of Eretz Yisrael were really very, very poorly understood for many Torahs. And as he suggests, this is where Chaim Cohen is coming from when he says we can't live in Eretz Yisrael. There's simply too much doubts about how to keep the mitzvahs of Eretz Yisrael. But certainly since the time of the Chaf Mitzvahs and on, there's been no. This area has been tidied up in halacha, and the Masorah has been restored. Finally, of course, around this area, there's the view, we need to know again, as I mentioned, what is the consensus of Poskim and the Baalei Halacha that we follow. Again, the Shulchan Aruch, the Ramah, the classic Poskim that we follow, do not adopt either the Megillas Esther's reading of the Rambam or the view of Reb Chaim Cohen that inability to fulfill mitzvah Saturius Baret is enough to suspend it. Having said that, though, again, it is clear both from the Poskim and from practice of Klal Yisrael that there's a limit to how much Mesiras Nefesh we need to have to live in Eretz Yisrael. And exactly where you draw that threshold is unclear, but it is clear that that people didn't move to Eretz Yisrael when it was gravely difficult to do so, and therefore it continues to remain a question: what level of Mesiras Nefesh, what level of sacrifice is one obligated to do this. But in and of in itself, the raw sugya of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, as I said, is a halachic debate that shouldn't become confused with the debate around Zionism. The Vilna Gaon, as I said, pushed his Talmidim to move to Eretz Yisrael. The Vilna Gaon himself attempted to move to Eretz Yisrael and was unsuccessful. But the Talmidim of the Vilna Gaon, Rabbi Hillel Mishklov, and others speak about this. The Vilna Gaon had a Talmud, the Pa'as HaShulchan, who wrote a sefer on Hilchos, the agricultural halachos of Eretz Yisrael, and the community of the Talmidim of the Vilna Gaon exists to this day as the Purushim in Yerushalayim, many of whom remain Purushim, and many of whom became part of the wider community and were involved in setting up the first settlements in Eretz Yisrael. Places like Petach Tikva and so on were set up by products of the Talmidim of the Vilna Gaon. The Talmidim of the Baal Shem Tov moved en masse to Eretz Yisrael. The Baal Shem Tov believed that one should move to Eretz Yisrael, and the Talmidim of the Chasam Sofer moved to Eretz Yisrael. This was the wave of Hungarian influx to Eretz Yisrael, part of the old Yishuv. In the case of the Hungarian influx, very fiercely anti-Zionist, but also very fiercely pro the idea of moving to Eretz Yisrael. So to summarize what I've said in this share, there are two relevant mitzvahs one needs to look at: Yishuv Eretz Yisrael and Kivush Eretz Yisrael. Kivush Eretz Yisrael is convincingly a chovas tzibur, a national mitzvah, and there's good grounds to argue it isn't a chovas yochid in any way at all. Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, it seems that a consensus view of most of the poskim would be that it is a mitzvah and perhaps even a chova. Ramesh Feinstein has a tshuva, I should mention just in the interest of full honesty, in which Ramesh Feinstein makes a distinction between a mitzvah and a chiyuv, right? We're aware of the concept of a mitzvah kiyumis, a mitzvah which, if you do, you are makayim a mitzvah, but there isn't a chiyuv to do. Ramesh argues based upon the sugya, Yishuv Eretz Yisrael is a mitzvah kiyumis, and that's how he explains why relatively little self-sacrifice is demanded for this mitzvah. I'm not aware of any major posek who argues that there's no mitzvah at all to live in Eretz Yisrael. We'll come to the view of the Satmar Rebbe, in which sort of the Shalosh Shavuos is a halachic suspension of the mitzvah. But in general, as far as I know, all the poskim can agree it's a mitzvah, even though there's significant debate about how much sacrifice one has to make for it. So Kivush Eretz Yisrael, probably a consensus to say it's a chovas tzibur. Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, not probably, but definitely a 99% consensus that it is a chovas yochid, or at least a mitzvah yochid, a mitzvah on the individual. And this isn't where the machlokas around Zionism starts. So often when you hear discussion around religious Zionism, so you'll hear a lot about Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. I'm doing the same thing. I'm also starting with Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, but simply to, in a sense, remove it from the equation. That isn't where the machlokas starts. And many fierce advocates on both sides agreed with the view that there's a mitzvah of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael. Sorry. So it may be a mitzvah that's already been accomplished. The Rambam seems to be mashma that it's an ongoing mitzvah. Yeah, we discussed this very briefly around when the Rambam says that a mitzvah that isn't for the Doros shouldn't be listed in the Torah mitzvahs. A mitzvah which isn't an eternal mitzvah shouldn't be listed in the 613 mitzvahs, like, for example, not ascending Har Sinai. He probably only meant by that mitzvahs which intrinsically have a time limit built into them. They are fundamentally limited to one particular era in history, like carrying the Kelim through the Midbar. Mitzvahs which are fundamentally mitzvahs forever, but we happen to have completed them, wouldn't be a temporary mitzvah, according to the Rambam, would be a permanent mitzvah. It just happens to be that we have fulfilled it. So Mechias Amalek, at some stage in history, let's say we had succeeded in wiping out Amalek, the mitzvah nonetheless is listed in the Tariag mitzvahs because it's a mitzvah l'doros. It's fundamentally an eternal mitzvah, and it just happens to be we've done it. Similarly, the mitzvah of Shivas Amim, wiping out the 7 nations of Canaan, and so on and so forth. I'm not here going into the questions of what to make of these mitzvahs and how to relate to them and so on. I'm saying if we just engage in halachic analysis, these are mitzvahs which once they're done, but nonetheless, in principle, they remain a mitzvah l'doros. So Kivush Eretz Yisrael, if the mitzvah is the Hachrim Tachrimim, as the Rambam says, just wiping out the nations of Canaan, then it may well be this mitzvah is already niskayim. Nonetheless, the continuation of the mitzvah, which would be Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, would still remain. That's so everyone's doing what else? No, right. So I think we'll stop there for today. We've run out of our allocated time. In Mitzvah Hashem, next week we'll begin looking at the having I guess sort of I hope dealt with the halachic aspect of it. In Mitzvah Hashem, next week we'll look at the debate around the modern practice of the modern theory, political theory of Zionism, and the Torah responses that arose to that.
Good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I will speak a little bit in Beinam Smecha. As I said, I'm not particularly going to mention figures like he's very, very interesting. The titles, religious journey, and so on. I'm going to avoid though particularly. A lot of great figures went on journeys both ways. So the title went on a journey from Hungarian anti-Zionist to Zionism. Rav Soloveitchik went from Litvish modern anti-Zionism to Litvish moderate pro-Zionism. The Beis Halevi moved. A lot of figures moved. Just for the sake, I'm not particularly going to look at the history of like each individual. I'm definitely going to draw on some of the points that Beinam made as philosophical points. Yeah. But I mean, yeah, assumption is he hasn't been destroyed. I mean, yeah.
Brilliant analysis of Mitzvah Amalek. Must have been 2-3 weeks ago.
Of Mechias Amalek. B'Shalach, at the end of B'Shalach, the mitzvah of, yeah.
We have to recognize evil. It's a mitzvah of recognizing evil. That there is evil.